You're wondering why I haven't left the stage yet. Because next I have the honor and pleasure of welcoming your keynote speaker for the evening. She's someone that I consider a friend, a sister, and honestly also one of my panic text message emergency contacts. Dalia Mogahed is the Director of Research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, where she leads the organization's pioneering research and thought leadership programs on American Muslims. She's a former executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, where she led the analysis of surveys of Muslim communities worldwide. She co-authored the book, Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. President Barack Hussein Obama, yes, I said Hussein, appointed Dalia to the President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships in 2009. But let's be real, most of you really enjoyed watching her on The Daily Show just last year. Please join me in welcoming Dalia to the stage.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. Before I start, just want to let you know that we have volunteers moving throughout the hall today to collect your contribution to CAIR-Philadelphia. I want to start by asking for a very loud applause for Zahra Bilo for her amazing job as MC. And I'd also like us to thank the folks that have been serving us all night. Thank you very much for your hard work this evening. It is such an honor to be here supporting CAIR-Philadelphia, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. And I hear that you won some sort of athletic event recently? Okay, so congratulations. I don't actually watch football, but I hear it's a big deal. I actually had a friend who was in Philadelphia right after the victory, and he compared it to a World Cup, like what happens in a country after a World Cup victory. So it was a time of great celebration. I think the whole country was celebrating. Also, that you won and not the other team. I want to talk to you this evening really building on so much of what we already heard, about this moment in our history that calls us so loudly to step up and lead with compassion and service. And as I reflected on how I would approach this topic, two verses from the Quran came to mind, and two great Americans came to mind. I'll start with the verses from the Quran. وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. We did not send you except as a mercy, as an act of compassion to all the worlds. This is in reference to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where God is describing him as his signature quality as an act of mercy to all the worlds. Though he was a teacher, a guide, a great leader in so many ways, he was described as an act of mercy. And it is this quality that must be the signature trait. And when I talk about compassion, when I talk about this concept of rahmah, it is so much bigger than what we normally think of when we think of mercy. It is about an infinite, generous love for all of creation. And the second verse I reflected on as I thought about how to approach this is when God spoke to the angels and he was telling them about his plan to create humanity. And he said what means, I will put on earth a deputy, a vicegerent, describing our purpose on this earth as a being, a creature that was placed to act on the will of God with the purpose of justice on earth. And when I thought, who manifests these qualities? I thought about last month, Black History Month, and how we celebrated Martin Luther King and Malcolm X's legacies, and how these two leaders of the civil rights movement, as we refer to it today, of course at the time it wasn't called that, it was about justice and equality, freedom and justice, that these two leaders set examples that we desperately need today. Many of you may not know this, but both leaders actually have connections to Philadelphia. Martin Luther King attended Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester. It's since been closed, but he studied there beginning in 1948. And interestingly, his transcript showed that he was getting C's in public speaking. So don't feel bad if it's not easy for you right away. He still, though, despite that, graduated in 1951, first of his class. Malcolm X, I didn't know this until I did the research, actually lived in Philadelphia for a short time. And we know this because his FBI file was very detailed. I was 15 years old when I stumbled on a book in my high school library about a man who transformed himself, his community, his country, and indeed the entire world because of his ideas, because of his faith, because of the power of his courage. To my surprise, I actually shared this man's religion. And reading his autobiography set in motion my own lifelong journey to learn and live that faith. That man was Malcolm X, or Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, as he later would be named. Learning about him and his struggle for Black liberation was the day I went from being a Muslim in America to being an American Muslim. His story encapsulated the idea that Islam was indigenous to America, had been here from the very beginning, held in the hearts of early explorers, of enslaved Africans and immigrants from around the world. It also helped to shape and inspire a movement for freedom and equality, just as it had at its own inception. And for millions today, it continues to do so. Both of these great Black leaders fought for human rights and equality for all people, both inspired by their deeply held religious convictions that call on us all to stand for justice and freedom. Now, some will question our right to lead such a movement. Some might actually wonder to themselves, maybe, how it is that someone who looks like me is up here talking about freedom when I might not look that free myself. Yeah, I've seen the images on TV of women dressed like me, portrayed as suppressed, subjugated, and abused. And I'm not here to tell you that this doesn't happen, because unfortunately, Muslims are guilty of being human. and human society around the world needs to get much better about how they treat women. But I'm here to tell you that's not the whole story. In fact, my decision in my late teens to wear hijab was inspired by reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. At the time, it was my feminist declaration of independence. Independence from the cultural pressures put on women to conform to an impossible and very Eurocentric standard of beauty. And look, there are advantages, okay? So, for example, travel is stressful on everyone. But for me, I get a free, almost guaranteed, a free full body massage, care of TSA, every time I travel. And then there's just the expectations. I exceed expectations just by opening my mouth and speaking English on many days. Plus, there's the compliments, right? So if I'm outside in the summertime, almost every other person will stop and say, "You look hot." I'm like, thank you. I have been working out, so yeah. Today, my daily decision to be so visible, so many of our daily decisions to be visible, in a time of rampant Islamophobia, is simply about putting conscience over conformity. Doing what we believe in, even if it's not popular. And I'm not alone. The organization I work for, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, we do research on American Muslims. And we found that despite bearing the brunt of Islamophobia, Muslim women are responding with resilience and solidarity with other targeted communities. And it is this very idea that is at the heart of the legacies of the two men that we just paid tribute to. Martin Luther King said, "The hope of a secure and livable world lies with disciplined nonconformists who are dedicated to justice, peace, and brotherhood." And it gives me great pleasure to do away with a myth that we often hear about Dr. Martin Luther King. We are often told that Dr. Martin Luther King practiced, quote, passive resistance, aimed at inspiring pity or sympathy from his oppressors, or appealing to their better selves. But as Professor David Chappell wrote recently in the Washington Post, this mischaracterizes his strategy entirely. Dr. King described his methods as active resistance. They use nonviolent means of organized boycott, protest, and strike to force a change in the status quo, not by inspiring pity, but by leveraging those in power's desire to avert economic loss and embarrassment. Very different things. King was a clear-eyed, strategic leader who used the strength of the many against the few who held the power. And those strengths will never, and he knew this, will never be in the use of violence. This was the lesson he learned from Gandhi. As he reminded us many times, freedom is never given, it is won. So we must continue this nonconformist active resistance today against the very same evils both men worked so hard to eradicate: racism, militarism, and economic exploitation. And I believe we have to do this in at least 5 ways. The first is we have to start with ourselves. It starts with self-liberation from the chains of ego, arrogance, and the need for societal approval. These false gods keep us shackled to a status quo. And I say this with all the love of being an immigrant myself and the child of immigrants. I say this in love that we must do better. Rather than challenge a class and racial hierarchy, so many of us simply worked to ascend it. We must start with self-resistance, self-purification, and introspection. We have to look around us at our fellow Americans and see them as our equals. And I say this by, as in contrast to seeing ourselves as either below, having some sort of inferiority complex, like we have to appease or win them over, or in an antagonistic way, where they are overlords, rather, they're not overlords to appease or enemies to conquer. They are fellow human beings to share with generously. And this is the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He was born into what we would call today incredible privilege. He, yes, was an orphan, and this was an important part of his development so he could gain the compassion of the marginalized, the compassion of knowing what it's like. But his lineage was that of nobility. So he was born into privilege in a hierarchy that put people like him on top. And yet he came with a message that dismantled this hierarchy. He relinquished privilege for the sake of truth. And that is the example we must follow. We cannot relinquish truth for the sake of the promise and the false promise of eventual privilege. The hierarchy is not what we should be ascending, it's what we should be dismantling. The second thing we have to do is we have to replace fear with facts. Fear is our diet 24 hours a day. It makes us willing to accept authoritarianism, conformity, and prejudice just because we're afraid. We have to educate ourselves to replace these fears, which are rooted in ignorance, and understand that fear kills freedom. The third thing we have to do is we have to remain outraged. We have to remain outraged. We cannot let ourselves be lulled into accepting what is going on around us as the new normal. The scary part, as Zahra so beautifully said, about what is happening today is that it sets not only a legal precedent, but a cultural precedent, a new normal, where it's just another Tuesday when our president retweets racist propaganda from a far-right fringe group in another country about our community. It's just another Wednesday when he calls a rally that involved Nazi symbols having good people on both sides. This is not normal, and we cannot let it become normal in our own minds. Next, we have to organize across color and creed. We cannot isolate ourselves. You know, I used to live in Pennsylvania. Shortly after 9/11, in fact, the day after 9/11, I moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And that same week, we were hearing about arson attacks and bomb threats and people actually being beaten in the street as the country dealt with the aftermath of the terrorist attack. And our community was terrified, in addition to being outraged by the attack on our country. And so we weren't sure what to do that first Friday after 9/11. Should we go to the mosque, or might it be a target? We eventually decided to go because we weren't going to let anyone tell us how we were going to be Americans, how we were going to practice our faith in our own country. And what we found in that mosque, in that Pennsylvania mosque, in that first Friday, with that not angry protests, not people there telling us that we didn't belong, but rather half the congregation were allies, people from other faiths who were there in solidarity with us. That outcome was the result of years of relationship building, of years of interfaith and intercommunity dialogue, the work of organizations like CAIR. That's what made that day possible. We have to spend just as much time planting trees as fighting fires. We have to organize across color and creed because, it's obvious that the enemy of our civil rights is not differentiating. They're coming after all of us. We would be crazy not to work together against this common threat. And finally, we have to take back our country. We have to vote. We have to vote. You know, I do research on American Muslims, right? And American Muslims are still the least likely to be registered to vote among American faith communities. And this is among people who are qualified, who are eligible to vote. And we've actually done research on why. Why don't people register to vote? Why don't they participate in elections? The number one reason is they say they don't think it makes a difference. They don't think it makes a difference. My response to this sentiment is, if it didn't matter if you voted or not, certain people wouldn't be working so hard to keep you from voting. Think about that next time you decide to stay home, especially in an election year like the one we're about to have. We have the opportunity to take back our country, to take back Congress. If the events of the last year and a half don't motivate us to get out there, I don't know what will. So in honoring the legacies of these two nonconformists, let's commit ourselves to leading lives of struggle, not simply sympathy for those victimized by injustice. Thank you.